All right, so we're just going to look at three different instances of monopoly from the time period, and shows how these things can play out very differently. So your famous one is Standard Oil, okay, which is the company formed by Mr. Rockefeller in 1870, and the company grows by horizontal integration, but then also by vertical integration, where it starts by just buying refineries, but ends up buying the whole network, and ruthlessly efficient. The company was very, very efficient, so they really push the technological frontier forward. They get really, really good deals on their shipping rates, since they are they basically have what's called monopsony power, where they basically they are a large buyer, and so they can use that power to get lower rates. They have examples of efficiency. They were able to find other uses for some of the waste products. Now, Ida Tarbell, highlights some of Standard Oil's business practices. They're like anti-competitive business practices, and this is an example of something capturing the public's consciousness, and then the government brings suit against them and then breaks Standard Oil up. So actually, many of your gas stations today, I'm trying to think of the ones off the top of my head, Texaco and Exxon, I believe, are descendants of Standard Oil. So the way it works is, if the government says, look, you have a monopoly, monopolies are bad, you have to be broken up into separate companies. Those companies are separate. They are totally separate companies. And those companies now must compete against one another. So that's what happened. They broke it up, and those companies had to be competitors. Okay, now what's interesting is when we look at prices, the consumer wasn't really being affected. The consumer was actually getting lower prices even at the height of Standard Oil's market power. And many of those like cheap rail rates that Standard Oil got were being passed on to their competitors as well. So there wasn't direct harm. I mean, certainly there were competitors put out of business by Standard Oil, but at least in terms of consumers being harmed, there's not much evidence for that. And their market share was falling in this time period. So it's likely that their market power would have diminished further. This is a similar story to kind of what happened with Microsoft, where the government brought suit against Microsoft for their monopoly dealings. They're kind of anti-competitive practices. You could look into that. There's all sorts of shady stuff that Microsoft was doing. But kind of by the time they brought suit, Microsoft had already lost their monopoly or their significant market power in operating systems. And so this is sort of the weird paradox where, usually by the time something, reaches the public consciousness, competitive forces take hold and the monopoly goes away. That's not always the case. You could think some of our large corporations today, may take a long time for competition to displace these things like Google and I'd say Amazon, although Amazon already has pretty significant competitors. But we'll see. Okay, U.S. Steel is kind of the opposite case, where they're scared of being broken up, so they deliberately stop innovating and they deliberately kind of hamstrung themselves to make sure they're not broken up. So they're really the first billion-dollar company. They're still around today, and they're formed by merging smaller companies. But they kind of are so scared of being broken up that they really stop innovating. And this is sort of the downside of that antitrust legislation. And this is where consumers are harmed. Kind of a similar story as I recall. I won't go into the details, but one night I was out with some people that work for a tech company, late night drinking, and I was talking to them, and I said, well, what are you guys worried about? What are you concerned? What's your big concern? You're this monolith. These are people that were fairly well placed at the company. They don't work there anymore, by the way. So don't go looking for them. And I'm not going to mention the company's name. But they were. And I was like, what are you guys worried about? Are you worried about potential competitors? And I listed off some competitors. I was like, are you worried about innovation? And I kind of outlined some innovations that might cause them to be obsolete. And they said, no. The thing we are concerned most about is the government deciding we are a monopoly, and they were like, and we are a monopoly. let's not, monopoly is not, I mean, kind of using monopoly and market power interchangeably here. The significant market power is what I mean by monopoly. And if you look at that company, they have, tons of lawyers whose entire department of lawyers whose only job is to convince the government that they're not a monopoly. That is value extraction. I mean, that is that is wasted money. That is money that is not creating value. That's not growing the pie. That's just a group of people trying to convince another group of people not to break this company up into smaller pieces. So there's downsides to there's potential downsides to this type of regulation, where you have money spent money not being spent to innovate, or money being spent just for political purposes. That's not to say it shouldn't exist. I mean, of course, there are positives too. You don't want monopolies to run rampant, and you don't want toothless regulation. It's sort of like what we've seen recently is a lot of this antitrust stuff hasn't really been enforced. So you can look in the details of this. Basically, since the 70s or 80s, I believe there's like a Bork ruling on this, which kind of tamps back the U.S.'s pursuing of antitrust regulation. And this is maybe behind some of the concentration that we're seeing lately. Although I would be skeptical of that. I think mostly of this is just due to market forces and kind of the era that we are in with where technology is. Okay, another example. This is a fun example, and I have a video that I made about this. Although I got my buddy Demorge to narrate it, so it's not going to be my voice. I got somebody who sounds much better than me. I wish I could just have him teach the classes. He's got it would be much more better experience for you guys. But anyways, so Edison is basically a patent troll. So Edison, he patents the motion picture camera. He owns the movie theaters. He owns the cameras themselves. You have to like pay him to use the cameras. You have to exhibit in his theaters. And so this when there's not competition, the quality suffers. So movies were bad, basically. Movies are boring because there's not competition. There's one guy controlling it, and he would sue any competitors. Hey, you can't make movies. I invented the camera. And so what happens is they just run away. Where do they run away to? Los Angeles. So thanks for being a patent troll, Edison. Now, due to Edison's trolling, LA is the second largest city. Okay. And as I mentioned, there's a taste mismatch. Basically, he's making bad movies. So there's like this market forces to, hey, we want better movies. Producers flee, and there's also antitrust regulation. Now, in the present, as I mentioned, this is all in the past, obviously, history class. But bring it to the present, though. This is monopolies and market concentration is a growing and real issue. There's a podcast assigned to that effect. You can look at some of the data. So everything above this line has become more concentrated. Okay, so these are the industries that have become more concentrated from basically the 90s to the mid to 2012. Okay, this has only gotten worse in the past 8 years, and only gotten worse with the pandemic. And so all these industries are trending towards concentration, meaning there's a couple of firms that dominate these industries. What's so bad about that? Ultimately should lead to higher prices or less innovation. Actually, there's another issue. Another way we could look at this is if you take an economic theory, price should equal marginal cost. You don't have to worry about that, in this class. But the theory is the price should, in a competitive market where there's lots of firms competing, the price should be close to what the firm's cost is. Okay, because the competitive pressures will push the price down. When there's a monopoly, the monopoly gets to charge a much higher price above its costs. And so what we can see is these markups, the difference between the costs and what the actual price is, have really shot up since the 80s, which would suggest market concentration is being passed on to consumer. Now, overall, in most industries, prices have gone down, because you kind of have two forces. You have market concentration, which is pushing prices up, but you have lots of innovation still, which is pushing prices down. So you can still have prices going down, but market concentration still being an issue. And we've gone over this before in discussion, but this is just to give you some, a case study in the present. You have how Facebook has maintained its monopoly. So previous social networks were displaced. So you had Friendster, and then you had MySpace, which were basically displaced by Facebook. And Facebook has been very vigilant in maintaining their monopoly, not to go the way of their previous competitors. And so they typically do this by horizontal integration, where they buy up their competitors. Instagram would be an example. They have an app tracking company that they bought that basically lets them know when social networks are just getting off the ground, and then they try to buy them when they're just getting off the ground, and essentially kill them in the crib, so they don't have to compete with them. So this is TVH as an example of that. They keep trying to buy Snapchat, getting rebuffed, and then if they can't buy them, they just copy them. So, as I said, you have, in many ways, that late 1800s looks a lot like the present, with increased market concentration, increased concerns about that market concentration, and just like then, it's unclear what the best course of action would be. Should we just wait around, wait for new competitors to enter the market and ultimately displace these companies, which would happen eventually? Should the government break them up like they did with Standard Oil? Should the government just stop them from acquiring competitors? So it's not clear. There's no right answer. Serious, intelligent people can disagree about what the best course of action will be to deal with this market concentration and these large companies with significant market power.